Good evening. Welcome to this episode of Cocktails with a Curator. I am Xavier Salomon, the Deputy Director and Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. This evening, I am going to talk about a medal. And this is a very celebrated and well-known medal produced during the 1470s and 1478 for one of the greatest patrons of the Italian Renaissance. And this was produced and created by an artist we've already encountered in our cocktails, and that is the sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni. I am talking about this medal because we've talked in the past few months about a number of significant gifts that came to the Frick in recent times, especially pieces of porcelain from the collection of the late Henry Arnhold. But this medal is actually part of a significant group, a very generous gift and partly a promised gift of one of the greatest collectors of medals in this country. And this is Stephen Scher, Dr. Scher, with his wife, Janie Wu Scher. And they have been so generous as to donate to the Frick a substantial part of their collection of medals, which go all the way back to the early Renaissance, when the idea of the medal was invented effectively in the modern world, all the way to the 19th century. And the medals that are now at the Frick represent all of the aspects of this incredible medallic form. I am particularly fond of medals because actually one of my very first jobs as an intern many, many years ago was at the British Museum in the Department of Coins and Medals. So I'm very thankful to Steve and Janie Scher for allowing the Frick to become one of the museums in the United States with one of the greatest collections of medals. A part of this collection was displayed in an exhibition which Amy Ng, my colleague, curated in 2017, The Pursuit of Immortality. This was an exhibition about the art of the medal and highlights of this great collection that is at the Frick. And Dr. Scher and Amy worked very much on this project with the great task of effectively creating a catalog of the entire collection of medals, which came out last year. And this is a very hefty and beautiful volume, which encapsulates the whole of the Scher collection of medals in it. Now, medals, of course, are often confused with coins, and there are actually a number of differences between the two, but the most simple and easy way to distinguish the difference between a coin and a medal is that a coin has a currency value. A coin is something that is used as money, while a medal is a commemorative object which has no currency value. I mean, of course, it has value in terms of its artistry, in terms of the materials used. Some medals were made out of gold and silver, more often bronze and sometimes lead and even other materials. But the basic distinction between the two art forms is the currency issue. Medals in the Renaissance, of course, were heavily based on ancient coins. And so they were clearly looking at some of these prototypes. The object I'm talking about tonight is created by Bertoldo di Giovanni. And as I said, we've encountered Bertoldo already as one of the great pupils of Donatello and one of the earliest masters of Michelangelo, but also, more importantly, one of the greatest artists and favorites of Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo de Medici. And the story about the medal I'm talking about today is directly related, obviously, to the artist who created, but especially to the patron. And the significance behind this object is linked to a series of events which touched the life of Lorenzo il Magnifico very directly. When we had the exhibition on Bertoldo di Giovanni last year, we displayed this medal from the Scher collection, but we also displayed another example of the same medal from the Bargello in Florence. And here you see 6 vitrines which were in that exhibition. We know that Bertoldo was very well known for his designs for medal. Several contemporary sources relate to this and describe him as a medal maker. In fact, only 6 types of medals survive by Bertoldo that most scholars agree that they were all created by him. And so what we did in the exhibition, together with the co-curators of the show, Amy Ng and Alexander Noel, we collected 2 examples of each medal. So effectively what you see here is 6 vitrines that show 6 medals, but each medal is in 2 examples. And the reason for this is the fact that medals are objects that were always intended to be touched, passed around, because their form is something where it cannot be seen all in one time, in one go. You effectively have to get a medal and then turn it upside down, back to front, to see the opposite side. All medals have an obverse and a reverse. So you either display medals in a vitrine where you can look at them both sides, or you effectively do what we did in the exhibition, which is you borrow 2 examples of the same medal, and with one you show what is called as the obverse of the medal, let's say the front, and on the other one you show the reverse, the back of the medal. So even though these were 12 medals, they show the 6 medals that Bertoldo produced. And third from the left, you can see the Patsy Conspiracy medal that I'm talking about this evening. And you can see that it is a medium-sized medal compared to what else Bertoldo produced. He produced larger medals and smaller, but all within a fairly consistent size range. Now, as I said, medals have an obverse and a reverse. This is a medal that Bertoldo produced in the early 1480s, probably, which commemorates the Sultan Mehmet II. He was at the head of the Ottoman Empire. He's the famous conqueror of Constantinople, then transformed into the capital of Istanbul. And here you see what a medal is usually composed of. There is an obverse, the front, with a portrait, usually, of a specific historic character, surrounded by an inscription, which gives us some information about the sitter. And on the back of the medal, on the reverse, there is usually a historic scene, sometimes an allegorical scene, as in this case, sometimes emblematic objects that refer to the sitter in the medal. So effectively, you have a portrait of someone and then further information about this person on the back of the medal. This specific medal is particularly interesting because it's only one of 2 known objects by Bertoldo di Giovanni that is signed. And if you look at the very bottom of it, under this chariot, between the 2 reclining figures, you can see Opus Bertoldi. So this is the work of Bertoldo. The medal we're talking about today, however, refers to a specific event which took place on the 26th of April, 1478, in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. Of course, the celebrated cathedral with its great Brunelleschi dome. Here you see it presiding over the city of Florence. And here is the interior. This is the choir of the cathedral, which is the site, somewhat changed, but this is the site where the events we're going to talk about today took place. To pair this medal with a cocktail, I chose a cocktail that is known as a Cardinale because of its very dark red, bloody color. Cardinale, of course, in Italian is a cardinal. And this is a cocktail which is made with gin, extra dry vermouth, and Campari on the rocks. And this, in a way, is to commemorate the events that took place in the Cathedral of Florence in April 1478. So the events known as the Pazzi Conspiracy took place on this site, but were directly, obviously, related to the Medici family. And the Medici family were the de facto rulers of Florence. We have to remember that Florence in the 1470s is, in name at least, a republic. But the Medici family for 3 generations had been effectively ruling the republic in all but name. This began much earlier with Lorenzo's grandfather, Cosimo il Vecchio, Cosimo de' Medici, known as the Pater Patriae, the father of the homeland, who was the first banker of the Medici family, who effectively took control of the Florentine Republic in a number of ways. And Cosimo's son and grandchildren were then following in his footsteps. And the 2 characters we're going to be talking about today are the brothers Lorenzo, who was somewhat older, and Giuliano, the Medici. They are the children of Piero, who was the son of Cosimo il Vecchio. And the two of them found themselves at the center of this conspiracy, which took place in April 1478. Lorenzo and Giuliano effectively ruled Florence, and you can imagine that there were a lot of criticisms and enemies, not only within the Florentine Republic, but also outside it. We now know that the conspiracy was, in fact, just to a large degree, subsidized and helped out by the Pope himself. And the Pope was, at this point, an enemy of the Medici family, Pope Sixtus IV. And the two brothers were the center of this conspiracy, which was organized by two other brothers, Jacopo and Francesco Pazzi. And the Pazzi family was an aristocratic family in Florence. They were a rival family, obviously, of the Medicis. And together, the two Pazzi brothers gathered a group of about 9 conspirators, which came from a number of aristocratic families in Florence, like the Salviati and the Baroncelli, but also included 2 priests. And the idea of plotting the assassination of a ruler or a head of state was clearly something that had happened a number of times in Renaissance Italy, and the examples that the Pazzi were following had only happened a couple of years earlier. On the day of the 26th of December of 1476, the feast day of Saint Stephen, outside the church of Santo Stefano in Milan, a group of aristocratic conspirators successfully murdered the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Maria Sforza. And basing the example of this previous conspiracy, the Pazzi decided to strike. And they decided to strike, again, at a church, in a religious site, and at the time of the Mass. So we have to imagine a Sunday Mass here in the choir of Florence's Cathedral, April 26, 1478. It is the Sunday before the Feast of the Ascension, and the cardinal celebrating the Mass was actually one of the papal nephews, Cardinal Riario. And the role of Cardinal Riario in the conspiracy, of course, is somewhat nebulous. We know the Pope was behind the conspiracy, but Cardinal Riario doesn't seem to have been aware that this was actually going to happen during this Mass. You have to imagine the cathedral packed with people. It's Sunday Mass. The effective rulers of the city are there. Both Lorenzo and Giuliano were present with a large group of people. And of course, the conspirators hid amongst this group in the choir of the cathedral. It's unclear when they actually struck. Different sources tell us at different times of a Mass. And so some people claim it happened when the host was elevated in front of the altar by the cardinal. Other people claimed it happened during communion. The most likely option is that it actually took place at the end of the Mass. And there is a famous moment in Latin Mass when the priest pronounces the words "Item missa est," which is the conclusion of the Mass. And at that point, everyone stands up and leaves the church. We have to imagine hundreds of people in the church and the confusion that this exit from the church must have created. And so it's most likely that this was the time the 9 conspirators struck. They attacked the 2 brothers in different sides of the choir. Lorenzo was on the right, of the altar, and as the attackers stabbed him, tried to stab him a number of times, they wounded him in the neck, but he managed to be dragged to safety into one of the sacristies. And the 2 doors that you see to the left and right of the altar on the sides of the apse are the doors of the 2 sacristies of Florence's cathedral. Lorenzo was brought to safety in the Sacristia delle Messe, and there the supporters of the Medici family locked the door to save Lorenzo. On the opposite side of the altar, on the left, Giuliano instead was struck 19 times and left dead in a pool of blood at the side of the altar. Lorenzo was taken to safety from the sacristy, and we know from descriptions from the time that he was shielded from the sight of his dead brother. The 2 brothers were very young at this point. They were in their 20s, and you can imagine the shock of Lorenzo of knowing that his brother had died during this conspiracy. The revenge of Lorenzo and Giuliano of Lorenzo over Giuliano's death was incredibly swift. The conspirators had actually not organized the subsequent events after the murder and the planned murder properly. And so they were counting on the support of the city and the citizens of Florence, which of course never came. And Lorenzo managed one by one to apprehend all of the conspirators, and each one of them was put to death, and then their bodies publicly displayed in Florence for everyone to see. The revenge of Lorenzo was incredibly forceful and bloody. And this event only strengthened his power for the next couple of decades in Florence. And so even though it was an incredibly traumatic episode for Lorenzo, it in many ways reinforced the support of the citizens for him and of his power in the city. So I mentioned that medals represent usually a sitter and a sort of historic event or an allegorical event. What is really remarkable about Bertoldo's Pazzi Conspiracy medal, which was created immediately after, a few months after the conspiracy, is that it conflates this idea of an obverse and a reverse. And in fact, it is a medal that doesn't have a straightforward obverse and reverse. It's a unique medal in this way, and it's a medal that packs in each side of the medal a number of very complicated things and information. So here is one of the two sides. And this side shows Giuliano de Medici. You see his name at the top in Latin, Iulianus Medicis, and his head. So the way you have a head in profile in a medal, usually, here it occupies half of the medal, and the head is floating over this structure below. And the structure below is the wooden choir of Florence Cathedral. And in fact, this is different from the way it looks today, but it was there at the time of the Pazzi Conspiracy. And if you look carefully at the structure, it's actually very well represented. You see on the left, the high altar of the cathedral, and you see Cardinal Riario saying Mass in front of it. There is a lectern in the middle, that is that weird triangular shape in the middle of the choir. And there are people inside and outside the choir. And outside the choir, you see a group of people with daggers inflicting wounds into the body of Giuliano. But what you see is almost a cartoon-like series of events. So on the left, there are people striking Giuliano for the first time. And then on the right, you see Giuliano's body on the floor as he's dying, as people are inflicting more wounds into his body. Below the head of Giuliano, there is a second inscription. And this inscription tells us, Luctus Publicus, public mourning. So this is the side of the medal which celebrates the tragic outcome of the conspiracy, the death of Giuliano, and the public mourning over the death of a beloved member of the Medici family. There are two more details. And here, in fact, what you have is the portrait, which is usual in an obverse, and a narrative of a historic event. But you also have two allegorical figures. And if you look just carefully to the left and right of this medal, there are two figures. And you can just about see them. But the figure, on the right is a representation of public mourning. The one on the left has been identified by one of the co-curators of the exhibition on Bertoldo, Alexander Noel, as a representation of Pallas Athena. And Pallas Athena was a goddess which was symbolized, which was linked to one of the emblems of Giuliano de Medici. This idea of depicting a narrative with a number of sort of events packed into one. And the other incredible detail, which if you look carefully, it looks like all the conspirators in this scene were actually naked. They were nude, heroic figure, is linked to contemporary works. And of course, here is a great painting by Botticelli, the stories of Lucretia, which are now in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. And if you look at this carefully, you can see that the different events from the life of Lucretia that happen on the left and right under the portico, and then with the central scene. So in effect, you see the same figure, the figure of Lucretia dressed in green and pink on the left, on the right, and again, at the very center of the painting. So in the same way that Giuliano appears a number of times in the medal, here you see Lucretia. And this idea of the nude figures comes again from contemporary works. And this is Pollaiolo's very famous and beautiful print of the Battle of the Nude Men. And so it is trying to set the conspiracy almost in a timeless moment in history. So it's going back, celebrating what happened that day with nude figures as if they're not specifically set in 1478, but they are all'antica, ancient-like figures. The opposite side, of course, represents the opposite. And this is what's so interesting about this medal, and what I was mentioning about the lack of an obverse and a reverse. So here instead, you have the head of Lorenzo de Medici, Laurentius Medicis, the inscription says. He's looking the other way around. He's still floating somewhat over the choir of the cathedral. But in this case, the inscription tells us that this is salus publica, public safety, public health. This is something that the outcome of which is a successful one. And at the bottom, you see the choir from the opposite side. If you remember, in the Giuliano side, the altar was on the left. Here, it's on the right. So you're physically in the cathedral. What is so clever about this medal is that you're projected in the actual site, place where this happened. So again, it's Cardinal Riario celebrating Mass at the high altar. But on the right, you see people trying to stab Lorenzo, and at the very left, Lorenzo and a group of people taking refuge, running out and taking refuge in the sacristy. The two little allegorical figures in this case are on the left, a lion, which is the symbol of Florence, the so-called Marzocco, and on the right, of course, the symbol of public health, public safety. This is an extraordinary object and a unique object. No other medal has ever been produced after this that is so packed with information, with knowledge, with this sort of clever combination of the events of the Patsy Conspiracy, but also the nature itself of a medal. This is a medal that challenges that nature. In many ways, it's a very pictorial medal. The depiction of the events in the choir of Florence Cathedral is particularly pictorial in the way it is shown. The portraits are also probably based on portraits. The portrait of Giuliano is definitely based on a portrait by Botticelli, the one of Lorenzo probably on another contemporary portrait that doesn't survive. Bertoldo produced this medal together with a canon in Prato, Canon Andrea di Filippo Guazzalotti, and we have a letter of September 11, 1478, in which Guazzalotti sends the first copies of this medal to Lorenzo, saying that Bertoldo was in Prato and together they produced this. So Bertoldo clearly designed and probably modeled the medal, while Guazzalotti cast it in, we assume, bronze, possibly even other materials. There may have been copies of this medal in silver or gold. We don't know. These examples were then distributed by Lorenzo. Why was this medal created? Most likely, it was created to commemorate the event. At the same time, Angelo Poliziano, one of the great literary figures of the court of Lorenzo de Medici, published also a text. He was in the cathedral in Florence with the Medici brothers. He witnessed the events and he wrote an account. This is something that Lorenzo wanted inscribed in history. Inscribed in history because it represented his success, of his victorious results over the conspirators, but it also represent this deep moment of mourning for his brother. And so he is celebrating the life of his brother through the mourning, the public mourning for him, and he's celebrating his safety. Giuliano was commemorated in grand funerals after his death, and Lorenzo himself presented 3 statues of himself showing his wounded neck from the conspiracy. And these statues made out of wax were placed as ex votos in a number of churches, in 3 churches in and outside Florence. Lorenzo himself, soon after the conspiracy, presented himself from the windows of the Medici Palace, showing his wound and showing that he was still alive. And of course, as I mentioned, his revenge was very swift and immediate. Bertoldo and Lorenzo worked together for a long time. Bertoldo worked for the Medici family, lived in the Medici Palace. One of the big questions is, was Bertoldo present during the time, at the time of the Pazzi Conspiracy? Was he in the choir of Florence's cathedral? We know he was a familiare of the Medici, so he, as I say, he lived in the Medici Palace later in his life, and Bertoldo died at the villa of Poggio a Caiano at the end of 1491, so he died in one of the Medici properties. Bertoldo and Lorenzo died very close to each other, and Lorenzo died only a few months later in 1492. This is the death mask of Lorenzo de Medici, which is now in the Museo degli Argenti at Palazzo Pitti in Florence. And of course, the end of the chapter, in a way, finishes with the deaths of both Bertoldo and Lorenzo. But the work of patron and artist in producing the Patsy Conspiracy Medal, it's an incredible witness to a specific historic event, one of the most traumatic and important events that happened in the early history of the Medici family in Florence and the early history of the Italian Renaissance. I hope you're enjoying your Cardinale, and I look forward to seeing you next week for another episode of Cocktails with a Curator.